morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. For me, it's morning. I'm calling from San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, originally known as Itzcuinapan, land of the Chichimeca and of the Mead peoples. Before we really get started today, I just want to let you all know that at the bottom of the screen, there should be an option for interpretation and translation. So it's a little globe. If you click on that button, you have the option to listen in English or Spanish, or just turn the interpretation off, so in which case it will be in English. Sí, hay la opción a escuchar ese conversación en inglés o español y no sé si ustedes pueden ver, pero hay una imagen de un mundo pequeño y puedes como elegir el idioma que quieres escuchar, inglés o español. Okay, so I like to start every talk that I participate in with gratitude. So I will start by saying that I am honored and grateful to be here today on this powerful panel with, inspiring women who have such important messages to share. So in our discussion today, we will look at the current state of the psychedelic field, examining the impacts of the increased use of psychedelics, both in clinical context, as well as their inclusion in decriminalization and legalization movements, and how this impact has an impact, well, how these movements rather have an impact on Indigenous sovereignty. We'll explore the best practices in interfacing between traditional knowledge holders and the plant medicines which they have stewarded for time immemorial, centering right relationship and the principle of do no harm, holding a respectful dialogue that moves away from extractive discourse and towards an exchange between equals. Co-hosted by the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund and Psychedelics Today, we acknowledge that the psychedelic movement is indebted to Indigenous cultures and seek to explore ways in which equitable sharing can take place between communities. And as you all know, today's webinar is free to attend. However, we encourage making a donation or contribution to Grow Medicine, a project and donation platform by the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund that aims to support Indigenous peoples and their biocultures. So briefly before introducing people, we have an hour and a half today here together, and we're going to aim for about an hour and 10 or an hour and 15 minutes of discussion between us, and we really invite audience questions. So at the bottom of the screen, there also is a Q&A function. So if you have a question that emerges, please feel free to pop it in the chat, and we'll try our best to answer it at the end of the conversation. So I'm going to read the panelist bios, and I'm sure they're in no way comprehensive because, these women are just so wonderful, and there's so much work that gets lost in a bio, but here we go. So Sutton King, Master of Public Health, Afro-Indigenous of the Menominee and Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, is a graduate of NYU School of Global Public Health. She is a nationally recognized Indigenous rights activist, published researcher, and social entrepreneur dedicated to developing and scaling innovative solutions to improve Indigenous health equity across sectors. Her focus centers access benefit sharing and culturally appropriate methodologies within technology, healthcare, and business. She joins the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund as an ambassador and bridge builder, sitting on the operations committee. In 2021, she was named an NYU female founder and one of the most 100 influential people in psychedelics by Psychedelic Invest and Psych Studio. In 2022, Business Insider recognized her as one of the 16 most influential women shaping psychedelics. Also introducing Miriam Bolat, Master of Science researcher, educator, organizer, facilitator, and ecologist with a passion for soils and nutrient cycles. Miriam works nationally and internationally to increase health and policy and community design. She is the co-director of the Indigenous Medicine Fund and the River Styx Foundation, and is on the board of directors of the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, IPCI, and the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. Victoria Anaí Ochoa from the Yaqui tribe is an activist, land and water protector, born and raised in Vicam, one of the 8 Yaqui towns in the state of Sonora, Mexico. Anaí is a mother of 2 little boys whom she is committed to raise with respect towards life and profound love for their culture and roots. Anaí also holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and has worked as a psychotherapist for the Mexican Ministry of Health. She is also the president of the Umomoli Civil Association, formed by Yaqui women. Anaí is currently the director of the Intercultural Yaqui Medicine Clinic, the first clinic in Mexico and the world that offers entheogenic medicine and treatments within the public health system. Anaí's commitment to the biocultural conservation of toad, Insilius alvarius, is rooted in her belief that to remember who we are, we shall harmonize our relationship with the earth and promote the prosperity of native spirituality through the practice of traditional medicine that tends to our health in a bio-spiritual way. And lastly, but not least, is Mona Palaka. And right now she is having difficulty joining. So, fingers crossed she makes it, but I will read her bio regardless in the hopes that she is able to join us for this session and share her wisdom with us. So Mona Palaka is a Hopi Havasupai Tewa elder, a spiritual elder. She holds a Master of Social Work degree and has worked to further social justice for Indigenous people from an early age. She is a featured author, speaker, and educator on Indigenous people's rights and has held posts of responsibility as treasurer for her tribe and has served on several committees for Indigenous peoples within the United Nations. She is widely known for her leadership in the Native American revitalization movement. Mona has gained recognition for her work as one of the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, a group of spiritual elders, medicine women, and wisdom keepers from around the world, sharing prayers for healing and peace. She is also the co-founder of the Turtle Island Project, a nonprofit program that promotes a vision of wellness by providing transcultural training to individuals, families, and healthcare professionals. In 2021, she joined the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York City as a senior fellow for the Original Caretakers Program. Wow. Yeah, so I'm so honored to be here with you all today. And I would really like to kick off this discussion with a question. I'll direct it at Sutton, but you're all welcome to offer your thoughts on this question. And as you all know, the name of this panel is Appreciation versus Appropriation. And I was wondering if you, Sutton, could kick us off by defining the term appropriation and grounding it in the context of the expanding psychedelic ecosystem.
Yes, and thank you for having me. I'll say, today we're really looking at the importance of respecting traditional Indigenous cultures and their practices. And I think if the psychedelic sector develops in a business as usual fashion, this will not only perpetuate the inequities and inequalities that we're experiencing in a very fractured healthcare system, but it will also be fundamentally in opposition to the transformational nature of plant medicines or so-called psychedelics themselves. And so what we really need to do in this time is we need to center appreciation versus appropriation, right? And appropriation is the act of really taking for oneself a certain element without the owner's consent, right? So there's a very important word, consent, right? That's protocol in an Indigenous worldview. So cultural appropriation would be the action of adopting elements of a culture to which you don't belong to without consent. And it's important to detail to remember in this, it becomes problematic when it involves an unbalanced power dynamic. So really being able to look at, decolonization and what that means and what is status quo. And, just for example, to help the audience understand this, it's cultural appropriation when a culture which has been historically suppressed and marginalized, has elements stolen and its meanings erased by, another culture that has dominated it. And so I think tools that we can leverage to really in turn center appreciation versus the ladder of appropriation and find balance and co-create protocols that respect Indigenous voices are one of two ways. One being free, prior, and informed consent, which is also known as FPIC, and the Nagoya Protocol. And so FPIC is really an essential building block of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it's really woven into the fabric of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it really implies consultation prior to participating in developments of projects that impact Indigenous peoples' natural resources. And I think it's really important that we're really centering not only consent in this time, but also consultation. And then moving to Nagoya Protocol, which is really what the international community has set up with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it was agreed upon in the early 90s, I would say 1992, and entered into the force in 93. But what it is, it's really an international agreement to conserve biodiversity, really a framework for regulating the access of users to any types of sharing or resources, whether that's monetary or non-monetary benefits with its providers. So that includes national state parties to the convention, as well as all Indigenous and local communities, and really supporting them and preserving and developing, their knowledge and their resources. Today, there is about 196 national states that have signed this. However, with the United States, they played a really significant role in creating this framework, but they have not signed it. But it really is providing, a framework on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing, really sharing how we can be in co-consultation and co-creation when we're looking at taking or extracting, plant medicines that are integral to Indigenous people's way of life. So I think that we have a lot of tools in this ecosystem that we can leverage that can center appreciation and really help us to co-create a future where Indigenous sovereignty is placed at the center.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important, and that's consent and consultation. And I think that leads me into my next question, which is directed at Miriam about allyship and how people can kind of approach that consent in a respectful way, and like that consultation too, because I know that you, Miriam, have spent years working as an educator and organizer supporting Indigenous-led organizations like IPCI. I'm a really big fan of the quote, move at the speed of trust. And I know that building relationships with communities who have painful historical reasons to be distrustful of outsiders takes time. And I'm curious how you began this path of allyship and how others in the psychedelic community, and perhaps even beyond, who have a deep desire to ally themselves in solidarity and reciprocity with Indigenous peoples, can do so. In my own path, I've encountered a lot of people who really want to be involved, but really don't know how, as cultural outsiders, to kind of start to build a relationship, and they're really afraid of making the wrong move. So I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you for organizing this panel. And I've been texting back and forth with Mona, and she's trying to, she's in the middle of a big storm. And so when she's able to connect, we'll get to hear from her. But I think there's actually a common theme, and we come at it from different directions. I had the good fortune of getting to be trained as an ecologist, and in ecology, what we're studying is relationships between different things. And we're always interested in, what are the exchanges between different parts of an ecosystem that lead to balance and lead to health. And so in the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, where we're Indigenous-led, some of the principles that we navigate ourselves by are right relationship and do no harm, like we mentioned at the beginning. But right relationship is really, I think, the place to start. And from an ecological perspective, what right relationship can mean is relationships that lead to balance, to abundance, to health. And I think that, even though we're talking about psychedelics and this kind of psychedelic renaissance, which is, this big hope of the world that we have something that we can work with that will really deeply address mental health issues and the issues of disconnection that we have on our planet. I think it's really important for us to remember that all of that's happening in the context of we're in the middle of the 6th greatest extinction. We know that this extinction is much human mediated by, the activities that we are engaged in as humans. So of course we have mental health issues, that we're in a time of, climate change or climate weirding, whatever we want to call it. And I think it's really interesting that as we consider, like Sutton said, what if we don't do business as usual with this healing renaissance? What if we actually conduct ourselves in a way that's not extractive, that includes consent, that includes listening, that we're actually doing something that's for all of us? Because we know that Indigenous peoples, the biocultures associated with these medicines that we talk about, right? In the fund, we talk about these keystone biocultures, ones that are unequivocally important, that if they go away, everything will be different for everybody. We work with ayahuasca, yahe, peyote, iboga, the toad, and mushroom, that the people that are part of these biocultures are associated with territories that are part of these biocultures that are unequivocally essential to the mediation and remediation of these 6th greatest extinction, also to this climate change. Like, we all need these biocultures to be healthy. So I really appreciate that you asked the question about how do we do that. And I just wanted to share a little bit how I enter into it. I wanted to share that I know Mona, if she doesn't join us, she's also shared, it's like and Anna E will be able to share about this too. When you start thinking about water as something sacred, water is a medicine to all of us, everybody who needs water. That teaches us a lot. And so in working on water issues, I got a very good training in how to listen to all the different needs, listen to the different kinds of wisdom that come forward, listen to how you attend to something in a respectful, right relationship manner. So a few things I'd like to share with folks today are that along with listening, and I like to put listening before and after everything, listening. But part of that is centering good process rather than having a goal. And that's part of respect. So good process means, along with listening, it also means if people have a traditional knowledge associated with something, if they have a heritage I'm not going to say right, I'm going to say heritage responsibility to something, then probably listening there first is going to give you the guidance you need about how to move into something in a right relationship. So often that means elders, it means knowledge holders, it's people who have cultural containers that are associated with that medicine or associated with that territory the medicine comes from. That's just going to lead to better process to listen to those people first. And then focusing on responsibilities rather than rights. What does that mean? Rather than starting with, I have a right to do whatever I want, I have a right to use this thing, I have a right to make money off of it, I have a right. What if you really ask yourself, what's the responsibility here? What am I trying to do? If what I'm trying to do is about mental health, if it's about addressing trauma, then what if I literally decide to take responsibility for not doing something that's going to cause more trauma than I might ever be able to address? Like, for example, appropriation causes trauma, right? I think that part of that is really valuing, and this is something that we've been in the fund, in the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, we've seen is really important, is valuing cultural knowledge, but as much as valuing cultural knowledge, valuing Indigenous-led and culturally based decision-making processes. So one of the things that you can do as an ally is look to and listen for decision-making or governance processes that are held and led by cultural leaders, community leaders in Indigenous communities, and really listen to those things and also support them, support the power and the ability for Indigenous-led governance bodies to get their voices out. So that's a key part of being an ally, and then listen to what you hear. I was speaking with a company recently who was looking at, bringing a lot of things to market and everything. And when they heard what this means, like from ayahuasca communities, they actually decided to take ayahuasca off their docket. Like they actually just listened. And I think that's really important in this time as the psychedelic movement is moving really quickly and things are unfolding really, not at the speed of trust, but at the speed of kind of like moving a bunch of capital, and the excitement, which is understandable, is to be willing to hear a no and change paths and move into something that is more about respect, and that's like flowing like water, right? Oh, I shouldn't go over here. I just heard that maybe a no is here, but maybe I can go somewhere else. So and I think that because we're talking about medicines that have traditional knowledge holding communities associated with them, placing in any process we're in Indigenous traditional knowledge holders as the primary stakeholders, as the ones who are setting the tone about how we're going to move forward with these medicines, is what will support a healthy psychedelic renaissance. It's what will support the vitality of these cultures and therefore territories. So not to sound trite, but I think it's a win-win for everybody, and unequivocally the direction we need to go, to listen, slow down in certain places, and understand that taking responsibility for doing that kind of listening will actually lead to much, much better future with less trauma and all of the healing that we're also hopeful about for everybody. So that's kind of where I'm coming from this morning.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important, and it's that, Indigenous peoples know what is best for them. And I think we have to, as wanting to be allies and, show up in support and solidarity, but really let them take the lead. And so I really appreciate you talking to that point of listening. And I think
I'll just throw in, we all have different roles and different things in a community of kinship. always need different things. You know, that's why I think everybody should be a gardener at some point. You know, tomatoes need really different things than pear trees to thrive, and we want the whole garden to thrive.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. Yeah, and I also have a question for Anai, kind of touching upon some of what you shared, Miriam, about, you know, biocultures and biocultural conservation. And I know that you are committed to the biocultural conservation of the Sonoran desert toad, Incillus alvarius. I would love to hear more from you, Anai, on the biocultural, as well as, you know, you mentioned in your bio, biospiritual aspect of this medicine work. I think in the Western industrialized world, we find ourselves really cut off from the natural world. And so we're sometimes disconnected from the fact that many of these medicines come from living plants. And in the case of toad medicine, living beings. What does it mean for these medicines to be natural resources that are facing conservation threats? And moreover, what does it mean for Indigenous peoples that many outsiders are now interested in using such medicines?
Muchas gracias, Yasmín. También muchas gracias por la invitación. Un placer, un honor estar compartiendo esta mesa, este conversatorio con ustedes. Pues como saben, yo pertenezco a la tribu Yaqui. Estoy en la biocultura del sapo o Incillus alvarius. Coarepa se llama en mi lengua. Y efectivamente, ¿no? En los últimos años han crecido exponencialmente todo el interés en todo el mundo sobre los psicodélicos, sobre las plantas sagradas, y el sapo ha sido uno de los más vulnerables, ¿no? Por tratarse de un animalito. Entonces, desde mi punto de vista, es muy válido el interés de las personas, de la humanidad, en estos procesos de sanación, de curación, de buscar, ¿no? el equilibrio, de buscar la raíz. Y sin embargo, los métodos, las formas en las que se ha venido dando esto ha sido muy perjudicial para las plantas y para el sapo. Entonces, no ha habido hasta el momento un mecanismo que proteja a la especie y probablemente se deba al desconocimiento de lo que está sucediendo en el desierto con el sapo y con otras plantas. Nosotros estamos muy preocupadas, porque sí, a través de un estudio poblacional que estamos haciendo y a través de la observación empírica que también tenemos cada año, vemos cómo disminuyen las poblaciones de sapo. Y no solo eso, sino que todo el daño que se le hace al momento de venir y recolectar la medicina, existe un saqueo, cómo también se llevan a la especie fuera de su hábitat natural. Recordemos que el sapo únicamente se da en el desierto de Sonora, es endémico de Sonora, no hay en ninguna otra parte del mundo. Y entonces es muy grave lo que está sucediendo. Es muy grave porque vemos imágenes de cómo las personas se llevan a los sapos y los guardan por días, los amontonan en tanques, en botes grandes, y cómo se aplastan, cómo mueren, o cómo se los llevan y los venden por internet. Entonces, yo valido el interés genuino de las personas de buscar sanación. Sin embargo, se necesita hacerse de forma respetuosa, de forma responsable, siempre considerando el bienestar del sapo o de las plantas. Entonces, nosotros acá También trabajamos con diferentes plantas en la clínica de medicina intercultural yaqui. Hay una crisis de salud. Hay una crisis de salud, sobre todo con el tema de las drogas, de las adicciones, de la metanfetamina. Y hacemos uso de las plantas y de otros métodos. Sin embargo, siempre estamos haciéndolo de una manera muy respetuosa, también haciendo alianzas con otras tribus, con otros pueblos indígenas de toda América, y tratamos pues de cuidar mucho que esto sea bien respetado, porque es muy sagrado, ¿no? Y pues eso creo que hace falta de alguna manera visibilizar lo que está sucediendo, porque en realidad la gente puede entenderlo. O sea, la gente puede respetar esta parte. Sin embargo, como que hay una especie de desconexión entre las comunidades indígenas y las tradiciones sagradas y el mundo occidental. Entonces, también gracias al trabajo del fondo IMC, estamos intentando hacer estos vínculos para que la gente esté bien informada, para que la gente pueda tomar mejores decisiones, para también nosotros apoyar a todas las bioculturas y podamos conservar las plantas y el sapo. Y como dijo Miriam también, no solamente estamos enfocados en eso, el territorio es inseparable, la cultura es inseparable de las plantas sagradas. Entonces, pues estamos haciendo muchos esfuerzos porque esto mejore, porque esto haya un acomodo, una reestructuración, una organización para que esto se lleve a cabo de la mejor manera.
Yeah, thank you, Anaí. Gracias. Yeah, I mean, a question that emerges for me that I didn't, ask in that framing of this question is also like, what are the major threats to Sapo as well? Because I don't think we've talked about those. So what are the existing threats that kind of impinge on the longevity of this medicine and its extension to future generations?
A ver, es que la traducción no estuvo muy bien. ¿Me puedes repetir otra vez la pregunta, por favor?
I wanted to know, quería saber más de las amenazas a sapo. Sí, las amenazas que hay que están, sí, amenazando la medicina y el animalito.
Pues mira, en primer lugar, hay como una especie de narrativa falsa que se ha esparcido en todo el mundo, de que la medicina es que es como de un pueblo indígena aquí de Sonora, de los seris, y mucha gente se valida y va y se toma una foto con los seris y toma sapo con los seris, con los comcac, y eso como que ellos adquieren un permiso de la tribu para repartir sapo por todo el mundo, ¿no? Entonces sabemos que eso no es verdad. O sea, no puedes en un fin de semana hacerte chamán, facilitador de sapo, para poder dar medicina por todo el mundo. Y obviamente detrás de esto está una visión de lucrar con el sapo. O sea, sobre todo de eso. Entonces, cuando ya la intención no es por la humanidad, por ayudar, por hacerlo esto de manera ordenada, pues ya se pierde un poco, ¿no? Y entonces han pasado muchos accidentes también con esas personas que no son profesionales, que no son chamanes. Ha habido hasta muertes incluso. Y entonces esa es una de las cosas que ha hecho que todo el mundo se entere de esta medicina y que todo el mundo quiera venir con esta tribu a validarse. Pero no solamente a eso, vienen en temporada de lluvia y vienen y extraen la medicina y tampoco y también desconocen la parte biológica del animalito. Entonces lo sacan de su hábitat cuando el sapo es muy territorial y el sapo no se le puede sacar a más de 500 metros de su casa porque si no se extravía. Entonces esta gente viene a juntar los sapos, se los lleva a exprimir a otro sitio y algunos los dejan ahí, los sueltan, ¿no? Que es lo menos peor que pueden hacer. Pero muchos otros o se los llevan a otro lugar o también los sacan fuera del territorio. Algunos hasta los venden por internet, o sea, tú puedes ver en diferentes páginas que venden el sapo por internet, ya no solo la medicina. Entonces, para la gente que también recolecta medicina únicamente, que no vende sapos, lo hacen de una manera muy agresiva. O sea, muchos sapos están enfermos por la manipulación que hay, ¿no? De la especie, cómo los exprimen. Entonces, aparte viene más gente y los vuelve a exprimir a la semana o a los 3 días. Entonces, estos sapos están muy mal de salud. Porque aunque Sonora es muy grande, como que se aglutinan en los mismos lugares los recolectores. Entonces ahí, o sea, es gravísimo porque nosotros hemos visto cómo en esos sitios ya no hay un solo sapo. Un solo sapo. Hay lugares en donde ya hay como una especie de extinción focalizada. Y es bien grave, porque aunado a esto, aquí en Sonora, siendo desierto, no llueve continuamente. Tenemos sequías constantemente. El sapo depende completamente del agua para existir. Y entonces o sea, realmente hay un peligro muy fuerte con el tema del sapo. Muy fuerte. Y pues eso, creo que esos son los peligros más fuertes, ¿no? Que la gente quiera comprar un sapo para tenerlo en su casa, para tener medicina en su casa, eso es impensable. ¿Por qué? Porque el sapo, la tierra tiene sus particularidades, sus propiedades, sus características, donde él se entierra por 9 meses, tiene su alimento del desierto, tiene los bichos, los animales, su dieta muy específica, donde no hay en otros lugares, y entonces esos sapos están condenados a morirse, ¿no? Los sapos que compran por internet, entonces es en vano que quieran comprar el sapo pues por internet. Y pues en resumen sería eso los principales riesgos, peligros a los que está expuesto el sapo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing. You know, as you're speaking, I feel myself tearing up because it's really painful to think about, you know, how we treat other beings. And I think also when it comes to plant life as well as animal life, you know, I think they're all living beings that we should treat with respect. And I think you also touched on another really important and alarming point is that, you know, that I think there's a lot of malpractice around you know, toad medicine in particular. And I think there, like you said, there are a lot of these courses, the 3-day courses that kind of offer this quick knowledge. But I think the difference is that, you know, in I guess facilitating sessions with this medicine and working with this medicine, you know, I think it's a lifetime of wisdom and relationship that's built as opposed to a quick 3-day course. It's quite concerning. So I'll move on to a question that I have for you, Sutton, and you know, for everyone on this panel more generally. But you know, since we're in the early phases, you could say, of this so-called psychedelic renaissance, and the field is still in formation, with standards and policies through which it will operate still being actively determined in many ways. You know, many of us who are interested in these medicines in a Western context are interested in them due to their revolutionary healing potentials and what they may offer for the field of mental health, but also spiritual health and general well-being. But I would love to hear you speak about issues around the accessibility of these medicines as they make their way into the mainstream. And, particularly I know that you are, doing work in kind of around Indigenous healthcare and things like that. And as Anaï mentioned, problems around methamphetamines and things that already exist in, certain, Indigenous cultures and populations. So, as these medicines make their way out into the mainstream, like how can we ensure their accessibility?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think, right now we're really all collectively reimagining a new mental health care paradigm. I think when we're considering reimagining that mental health care paradigm, we have to really consider Indigenous health, right? And where it is in the 21st century. And we are disproportionately impacted by mental health adversities and chronic illness. And when we look at the state of healthcare in the United States specifically, which is where I do a lot of work with Indigenous rights and healthcare, IHS is 50% funded, right? It's grossly underfunded, and that's Indian Health Service. And so if people aren't familiar, when our land and our resources was taken, there was this treaty that was, treaties that were signed that said, for this exchange, we will take care of you. We will provide you access to healthcare at no cost, right? And when we look at the state of IHS today, as I mentioned, grossly underfunded, high retention, right? The quality of care is poor, and it's devastated Indigenous peoples. And so to really be able to collectively heal and move forward, we have to take care of these sacred promises that were put in place, many, many years ago. And when we look at even the data, right, a basic way in which we need to be able to organize and create programming, the data isn't desegregated, right? There's a lot of erasure that's happening, which perpetuates a false narrative that Indigenous peoples aren't being disproportionately impacted by, the healthcare system today. So I think, when we're thinking about access to these therapeutics, it's important, one, to ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to basic healthcare, right? Healthcare is a right. And then more so when we think about, this question gets posed to me a lot, what about access to psychedelic assisted therapy for Indigenous peoples? Well, access to that looks like conservation, right? So we can unequivocally support Indigenous-led conservation and center Indigenous peoples and centering their own programming, their own cultural preservation, language programs, water rights. All of this is interconnected because when we think of Indigenous worldviews, many of us center kinship. And what is kinship, right? It's really this traditional way in which Indigenous communities and societies worked with each other on this concept of interdependence, requiring all things, both animate and inanimate, to work in relation to achieve harmony within Mother Earth. And it was really in this relational dynamic that people understood their responsibility and obligation to be good relatives to one another. And I think Miriam really touched on that on the question around allyship. But when we looked at the way in which a society worked, everyone affected by a decision had a say in it. And leaders who were primarily facilitators, how Miriam and I see ourselves as facilitators, we were responsible to all the people, the four-legged, the two-legged, the winged, right? The plant medicines, they're all our relatives, really ensuring that everyone's needs are provided for. And so when I think about, access, and I think about the way in which, this psychedelic renaissance is forging on, it's really important to, again, center Indigenous people's needs. Again, as we have been disproportionately impacted by settler colonialism, the first to be impacted by this, and the last to receive the resources we need to be able to heal. And we cannot achieve a new consciousness or this new awakening without making sure that everyone within society is taken care of.
And I love the reference to kinship. I've been really exploring that in my, personal life and practices. And Yeah, I've kind of become increasingly attuned to what is sometimes described as kin-centric ethics. And that is an ethics formulated upon attuning oneself to the relationality that exists between us all in the human and more than human world. And as you said, you know, within Indigenous cultures, kinship is a cultural value embodied in relation to ancestry, to future generations, to all that, you know, nourishes and sustains us. And yeah, I'm curious. I would love to hear from you all on this. You know, how can we as non-Indigenous peoples learn to be good relatives to our, you know, to Indigenous peoples and to the earth and, you know, to these biocultures around us? Like, is there a way that we can start embodying this sense of interbeing and relationality? And yeah, I'd like to open that question to you all.
Jasmine, I wanted to share an example of something that's happening that we've been supporting through the fund, and then maybe we can get more into that question. But I think part of what we're talking around is, if you're coming into sort of the psychedelic space, you're looking for your own healing, or you're looking to be active there, it's a question that's related to what you were talking about of kinship. Is, do you know where your medicine came from? Do you know how it was prepared? Do you know who's being impacted by you utilizing it? Do you know what it means that you're taking it? And, you know, some of these ideas like free, prior, and informed consent, access, benefit sharing, sometimes they stay very intellectual, right? So I think part of what we need is some experiences of how this can go in a good way, how we can honor traditional knowledge holders, how we can honor medicine sovereignty, and expand people's access to healing. And so I just wanted to share the example that's happening right now with iboga. And as many of us know, iboga, which contains ibogaine, is an extremely powerful medicine for addiction, for PTSD, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And over the last 10 years, many vets who were in armed conflict, people who, you know, were involved in killing a lot of people and saw a lot of death. And this was really impacting their families, their mental health, have gone to utilize iboga for healing, and it's been extremely successful. And we know that in Canada, it's being used more and more to address opioid use disorders, and really helping people get their lives back and their families back. Well, in that 10 years, we also know that the plant, iboga tabernanthe, has become dramatically over-harvested. It's become a plant that's poached on a regular basis by the same people who are killing elephants and taking ivory and poaching it. It's become almost unavailable to people who use it in their traditional initiation ceremonies. And so Gabon is where it's native, and it's one of the first places where this concept of Nagoya protocols has really been pushed. And in the last month or two, the Gabonese government has actually signed papers and put into effect some of the regulatory pieces related to the Nagoya protocol. And now you can do trade legally with iboga. It can be exported, and the iboga that will be exported will actually come from village plantations of different villages of different tribes that are Buitist, or people who utilize iboga traditionally. And these protocols were established and set with consultation by Bwiti people from around the country. And So that means in the future, if you have a family member who has a opiate use disorder and they want to go to iboga, you'll know if it came from a process that involved consent, and that benefits are going back to those communities. So just before we got deeper into your question, I did want to share this is real. We can do this as a society, and I think it really, really starts with asking and caring about what it means when you whoever you are, access a medicine for yourself for some reason. And that's what it means to take responsibility, just blindly take something because it seems interesting or fun or cool. So
yeah, definitely that increased kind of transparency and kind of being able to kind of source a medicine, know its trajectory, know where it came from, who held it in their hands, how it was processed and how it moved its way to you. And I think like that's a very kind of real example of interconnection as well, because it's not just an object or a medicine that has manifested here and now. It has to come from somewhere, and there's a relationality to where it has come from.
And a lot of times people we get really discouraged. We think people don't care, and there's reason to believe that. But like with the iboga example, we were able to share with the organization Vets what was happening with iboga, and they were shocked. They actually didn't know, and they decided that they wanted to make sure that vets who were benefiting and their families were able to help plant where it was being planted in plantations, and they were going to start sharing this information. So I think knowing each other and knowing these medicines and knowing the culture is part of creating care and responsibility. It's not the only part, but it is part of it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I would love to add, we're largely talking about the interconnectedness of all things, really talking about kinship, but I think we're also talking about sustainability, right? And what comes up for me is the 7-generation principle, which comes from the Haudenosaunee philosophy, which is my community, which holds that the decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. And so I think outside of, centering kinship, we also need to, as a community, center, sustainability. And those together will really support this deep allyship. And I think, going back to your question around how can people support an allyship and indigeneity and sovereignty, I think, being involved in any kind of anti-oppression work is really about recognizing that every person and everything, right, inanimate and animate, has a basic right to human dignity, respect, and equal access to resources, right? And I think that, being an ally is a way of being and doing. It's a way of life. It means deep self-reflection. It means really checking in with one's motivations and debriefing with community members in a continuous process. These movements and struggles do not exist to further one's self-own interest, or they're not extracurricular activities. Really, it's educating yourself in this ongoing process. Change is not easy, and you'll never truly be an expert in Indigenous challenges or realities. That's why we call it cultural humility, not cultural competency. But you can work in allyship.
Yeah, I really love also the transitioning from having something on a conceptual, intellectual level to, having it on a visceral, embodied, lived, level. And I think that comes to these practices of kinship, and it comes to practices of allyship. We can talk about them, but actually to, like, as Miriam has, illustrated, there are pathways also to enact them. And I see Anaí has her hand up too. Love to hear from you.
Gracias. Quisiera añadir que en este proceso de educación, ¿no? para el mundo, es muy importante llegar también a nuestros gobiernos, a los gobiernos de cada país, porque, por ejemplo, en México, en este momento hay 10 personas encarceladas por tránsito de ayahuasca. y un par por tránsito de peyote. Entonces, no es posible que el gobierno mexicano esté considerando el ayahuasca como un estupefaciente, equiparándolo con la metanfetamina, con la cocaína, ¿no? Entonces, es muy grave lo que está sucediendo ahora en México. Se necesita también que de alguna manera entre países, entre los países de forma institucional se eduque, ¿no? Y se pueda regularizar este tema de las plantas sagradas. Entonces, hablaba yo con un abogado y me decía, bueno, es que hay situaciones que sí ameritan cárcel. Por ejemplo, cuando los facilitadores han transgredido los derechos humanos, o sea, cuando han violado, cuando han violentado, cuando han matado, cuando han hecho las cosas de forma irresponsable con plantas, ahí amerita la cárcel, estoy completamente de acuerdo, pero el tránsito, o sea, no debería de ser penalizado. Si se comete una falta, no es por el uso de ayahuasca o de otras plantas. Entonces, hay una especie de confusión precisamente porque hay mucha gente que está haciendo mal uso de las plantas sin ningún tipo de conocimiento indígena tradicional. Entonces, la información se desvirtúa y llega a los oídos de la Secretaría de Salud o de diferentes países y piensan que la ayahuasca es una droga o que el peyote es una droga o que el sapo es una droga y entonces por culpa o responsabilidad de estas personas que hacen el mal uso y que muere gente y que entonces, pero no tiene nada que ver con el ayahuasca y no tiene nada que ver con el peyote, nada que ver con ninguna planta. Es irresponsabilidad de algunas personas. Entonces, creo que eventualmente estos diálogos, que este trabajo que estamos construyendo juntos, cada uno desde lo que sabe hacer, tiene que llegar a unos niveles más altos para que los gobiernos puedan firmar nuevos convenios, porque realmente no está regulado, no está platicado, los gobiernos tienen un completo desconocimiento de esto. Entonces, creo yo que desde la ONU o desde, no sé desde qué organismo se tenga que hacer esto para que baje a los diferentes países y que permitan hacer investigaciones también sin ningún tipo de restricción, ¿no? O bueno, que podamos hacer investigación con diferente tipo de plantas sagradas, pero también con psicodélicos, ¿no? Con otros psicodélicos, precisamente para revolucionar todo el tema todo el sistema de salud público, ¿no? Todo el tema de la psiquiatría. Y también para que se reconozca el derecho de los pueblos indígenas de ser autónomos en cuanto a salud se refiere, de nosotros como pueblos indígenas poder decidir la forma en que queremos curarnos, la forma en que queremos gobernarnos, la forma en que queremos cuidar a nuestra comunidad. Y como les digo, yo tengo mucha esperanza en que pues que se abran los caminos para que esto fluya de la mejor manera, que esto se reorganice, que esto se regule por el bien de los pueblos indígenas, de las plantas sagradas, pero también de toda la humanidad.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing, Anaí. And I really, resonate with your feeling of hope. And, I think that there are a lot of things changing for the better, however slowly they may be changing. And I have a question also for you, Anaí. We have about 10-15 minutes left of discussion, and then we will switch over to Q&A. I see there are some lovely questions from the audience, and when we do switch over to Q&A, I would like to, invite people who ask questions to Yeah, well, you know, we can invite them to the panel and they can turn their video on and ask their question, you know, in audio as well. But one question that I did have for you, Anai, before we switch over to Q&A is that for the Yaqui peoples, as for many indigenous cultures across the world, there is so much ancestral knowledge that has been lost as a direct consequence of systemic violence. And you know, I'm aware that working with these traditional medicines, there's an ongoing revival of ancestral knowledge. I would love to hear more about the importance of reviving traditional medicines within Indigenous communities and also addressing, you know, mental health issues and generational trauma within those communities.
Bueno, pues efectivamente, ¿no? O sea, todos los pueblos indígenas hemos sufrido del colonialismo, ¿no? Todo el tema del saqueo, todo el tema de que nos han quitado nuestras prácticas ancestrales, espirituales, ¿no? Algunos menos, algunos más. Aquí, pues en la tribu Yaqui ha sido bastante el daño que se ha hecho y hemos perdido diferentes conocimientos tradicionales, muchos conocimientos tradicionales. En el momento en que nosotros empezamos a trabajar con el peyote, con el ayahuasca, con el sapo, con otras formas, temazcal, etcétera, nosotros hemos visto como jóvenes, como personas mayores, como ellos estamos revitalizando nuestra propia espiritualidad. O sea, las plantas de poder, por ejemplo, el ayahuasca. El ayahuasca no es del desierto. El ayahuasca no es de acá. Pero el ayahuasca, cuando nuestra comunidad tiene una ceremonia, pues el ayahuasca nos habla nuestro propio idioma. El ayahuasca nos muestra nuestros propios elementos culturales, hace que entendamos las diferentes cuentos, los diferentes rituales, que encontremos una parte más profunda aún en lo que todavía conservamos. Pero no solo eso, sino que la medicina nos habla de qué manera nosotros podemos ayudarnos más en nuestra propia comunidad y a la gente de fuera también. Y cómo es que tenemos que llevar el camino de la medicina, de las medicinas. Y yo agradezco mucho a las diferentes pueblos indígenas que han venido a nuestro territorio, que han venido a compartir su medicina y sus conocimientos, porque no es, o sea, no es una apropiación cultural, es un compartir entre pueblos indígenas. Hay una gentileza tan grande dentro de los pueblos indígenas, hay una humildad muy grande de querer realmente ellos compartir con nosotros y también con el mundo las medicinas para la humanidad. Entonces, nosotros hemos sido muy cuidadosos, muy cautelosos en el momento de recibir estos conocimientos, de compartir estas ceremonias, de unir los rezos por nuestras tribus, por el agua, por el territorio. Entonces, al mismo tiempo que vienen y comparten sus conocimientos, nosotros compartimos también parte de nosotros, nuestra resistencia, nuestra fuerza, nuestra lucha. Compartimos como hermanos verdaderamente, ¿no? Las fronteras no existen realmente. O sea, somos parte del mismo continente, no hay divisiones. Y nos damos cuenta celebrando y rezando juntos. Nos damos cuenta de eso, de que somos hermanos, que no somos diferentes, que vivimos la vida un poco diferente, variada, pero al final de cuentas somos iguales y queremos exactamente lo mismo para nuestros pueblos, para nuestras tribus y para la humanidad. Entonces, la forma de cómo han llegado las plantas a nosotros y cómo poco a poco vamos recuperando el conocimiento perdido del sapo, por ejemplo, cómo esto va poco a poco, cómo esto la medicina nos empieza a traer el conocimiento y poco a poco entre los jóvenes, entre los mayores, lo vamos internando, lo vamos integrando a nuestra vida diaria, ¿no? Y vuelvo a citar a alguien por ahí, creo que fuiste tú la que dijo que era, bueno, fue Sutton, que dijo que es para nosotros, pero estamos construyendo ahora lo de las próximas generaciones. Entonces, es bien importante el trabajo que estamos haciendo y por eso somos tan cuidadosos y respetuosos, porque así como nosotros estamos construyendo algo de alguna manera nuevo, pero viejo o antiguo a la vez, entonces nosotros queremos hacerlo de la mejor manera para nuestros hijos, para nuestros descendientes, ¿no? Para la comunidad. No estamos separados tampoco del resto de la humanidad. Por eso es muy importante, también que sí trabajemos juntos, o sea, la parte occidental, la parte no indígena, que trabajemos juntos para lograr objetivos en común. O sea, es bien importante la protección de los pueblos. O sea, me he dado cuenta de que hay pueblos indígenas, por ejemplo, en la Amazonía, ahora que acabo de llegar de Brasil, cómo viven en extrema pobreza, o sea, sin siquiera agua, sin ni siquiera con lo más básico, pero ellos comparten un conocimiento, una sanación para la gente indiscriminadamente, porque lo hacen para quien llegue, le dan la mano y ayudan a quien llegue. ¿Y cómo es posible que nosotros, o sea, que se permita esa forma de vida, pues, ¿no? Entonces, a nosotros nos corresponde resguardar, proteger, cuidar, para que ellos vivan de la manera que ellos quieren vivir, ¿no? Y con eso nosotros aseguramos también que esto va a seguir creciendo, no solamente para ellos, sino para toda la humanidad.
Yeah, thank you, Anaí, for sharing. And it's lovely to hear about the kind of alliances that are being formed with, different Indigenous groups. And I'm aware that we don't have that much time left, but before we switch over to questions, I would love to offer, Miriam and Susan just the opportunity to share anything that was missed, to add a final word. Yeah, whoever would like to go first.
Just kind of echoing what Anaí said, this responsibility to really bring different perspectives and knowledge and ways of thinking and being together really reminds me of something that I share with the space a lot around just the prophecy of the condor and the eagle and what that means for all of us, right? And I think we are at the time of the eagle and the condor, and if you're not familiar what that is, it really speaks of the Americas splitting into two paths. So that of the eagle is that of the West and the condor of the South. And I think the path of the condor can be seen as the path of the heart or intuition or the feminine, also seen as the indigenous knowledge and ways of being and knowing. And then we have the path of the eagle, and that's more of the mind, the industrial, the masculine, often seen as that Western lens. And it was said that in 500 years that those paths would have the potential to come together to create harmony and really unlock a new level of consciousness for humanity. And, as the Western world has really begun recognizing the validity of indigenous worldviews, knowledge, and perspectives, right? Looking at plant medicines for healing and holistic, and organic, those are things that have always been akin to indigenous peoples. But really being able to decolonize right now, right? Really being able to look at the unbalanced power dynamics and what has been status quo. And really in turn, as we recognize the validity of indigenous worldviews and begin to center them, not only are we decolonizing, we're in fact indigenizing. And that's how we really are able to come together, and really restore the balance, because I think we've been quite out of balance for some time now. But again, that prophecy said there's a potential, not that it would be. And so we have a deep responsibility. And, I feel a deep commitment on this panel here today, the work that all of these warrior women are doing, and really just hope that the audience is able to take that, home with them and be able to share with their community and their kinship societies, so that we're able to really reverberate our messages, across the ecosystem.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I'll pass it over to you too, Miriam.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I would add, really appreciated the conversation, is just emphasizing this piece that being in right relationship and not doing harm means all of us need to take some big deep breaths and take time to handle the complexity. You know, what we need to conserve for future generations with toad is really different than what we need with iboga biocultures and those people. Like, you know, just like the relationships we have with family members, like, you know, like Anna E said, like you're relating like brother and sister, we need different things. And so I think that's just really resonating with me this morning, how important it is to think of these medicines, the biocultures, the territories they come from, the traditional knowledge, people who study 20, 50 years before they serve them, not 2 or 4 days like you were talking about, Jasmine, that each of these are require different kinds of tending. And so slowing down to the speed of trust, as you said, means like really getting to be thoughtful, handling the complexity, not thinking that everything has to be the same. You know, one of the places where this really shows up is when we think about conservation. A lot of times, some of us, like myself, who are, you know, trained at the University of California in conservation, we immediately hop to, well, we should grow more, we should plant more. That's the solution. And we've learned through doing our community-based assessments and with the fund, and learned through having conversations, that's like kind of just one way of looking at things. Like, for example, with ayahuasca, we found in talking to people, elders, what needs to happen in order for in 100 years for your culture to be really vital, for your medicines to be accessible to your people, for all the things they need. We didn't hear we need plantations. We heard we need territory rights, we need language schools, we need places for people to gather. And that's because people said, we already know how to grow our medicine. We know how to take care of these plants. We know how to process it. We don't need other people coming in and making plantations. That's not what's needed. What's needed is to be preserved, our ability to be on our land and take care of it in a good way. So I think those are really important things for us to think about. Jumping to conclusions about what conservation means from a sort of limited paradigm isn't helpful. Science can really support conservation, but it's just one little thread in a fabric, which is sometimes complex, sometimes really simple, like give us access to our land is actually kind of simple, but then it becomes complex. So anyways, that's what I wanted to share, is to really think about each thing and be open to the complexity of what that is, what that bioculture is, what that person is, what that community is. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Miriam. And you used a word that is one of my favorite words, which is tend. And, you know, I really love to think about how we can tend to each other, tend to the land, you know, tend to our relationships, our communities. And yeah, it's just approaching the other with deep care and reverence. So I really appreciate you using that word. Yeah, so I see that we have some, you know, questions in the chat, and I would love to, you know, invite people that ask those questions to, you know, ask them themselves. So we have a question, or 2 questions rather, from Christine McCleave, and I don't know if Christine, you would like to ask your questions live. Maybe you can just type in the chat and let us know.
Hi.
Hi, Christine.
I have really enjoyed this panel today, and I just want to say, Chimigwich, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge and the work that you're doing. I actually asked 3 questions, so I don't know, should I ask them all and just let them pick what they want to answer?
Yeah, like let's say maybe ask them all. Go for it.
Sure. I just kept thinking of you all were sharing very interesting perspectives and So the first question I asked was, how do we get the larger society to understand that appropriation is traumatizing? I appreciate you guys saying that. Because of the historical imbalance of power and past harms, how do we get capitalism or capitalists to care? That's something I've just been kind of grappling with myself. Another question is, how do we teach the larger society about Indigenous values like kinship without them culturally appropriating such concepts? Because when you were talking about that, and then we were like, yeah, everyone should understand that Indigenous worldview and perspective. And then I thought, and as soon as they do, they're not going to give us credit. They're just going to be like, oh, another one of these new age concepts that I'm just so into because I'm so woke and evolved, right? And the last question is, do you think legalizing the plants and regulating cultivation, use, transportation, and sales is the way to help conserve them? Or do you think decriminalization would be better? Thank you.
I'm happy to speak to the first one, which is about how we get the larger society to understand appropriation is traumatizing. I think we have to have a very honest and I'm sure challenging conversation about the harms that have been perpetuated by colonialism, right? When we think about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act for, natives in the United States and not having religious freedom to be able to protect their basic civil liberties, to allow us to practice and protect and preserve our inherent right of freedom to believe and exercise our traditional and religious, ceremonies, not being able to have that, and being criminalized and being harmed, I think if folks understood the plight of Indigenous peoples and what we've had to fight for to be able to sit in ceremony today, how we've had to protect those ceremonial ways that our grandparents were criminalized for, right? Perhaps they can begin to, increase empathy, right, around that, and really start thinking through another lens of how they can come into allyship, as we talked about earlier. So I think really, the most important conversations for us to have as a society are usually the most difficult and challenging, but how healing those conversations are when we do sit down and explain, what came up for us in a pathway of restorative justice in a sense.
Great, thank you. And the second question is, well, maybe Anai would be best to answer that, but maybe, should we repeat the question or are you okay to answer it, Anai?
I can repeat the question.
Okay.
So how do we teach the larger society about Indigenous values like kinship without them culturally appropriating those concepts?
Bueno, pues opino que la apropiación cultural es como una especie de copia, así copia de lo que el otro hace, idéntica, y eso pues no es posible porque cada cultura ha crecido, tiene una historia, tiene una cultura ancestral que no se puede repetir, entonces no se puede copiar. Entonces considero que, o sea, en el caso del sapo hay mucha gente que se está apropiando de cantos, de rituales, y entonces pues eso no es verdadero. Lo verdadero nace del corazón, ¿no? Y tienes que ser tú mismo al momento de ser, ¿no? Y de compartir. Creo que es importante hacer como un acercamiento directo de las comunidades indígenas con la gente. Visibilizar la voz de las autoridades indígenas, de las lideranzas indígenas con el mundo, con la humanidad. Que no haya intermediarios, que sea directa la voz, que conozcan la cultura directamente desde ellos, que se conozcan las formas directamente de la palabra de los abuelos, de las lideranzas. Creo que ahí, quitando del medio a estos facilitadores, a estas personas que tienen diferente tipo de interés, creo que sería muy bueno también para los pueblos y también para la gente, porque apenas así puede llegarles la información verdadera, los conocimientos verdaderos de la voz de los abuelos. Entonces, es muy importante visibilizar la voz de los pueblos indígenas.
Gracias, Anaí. And Christine, you had one final question. Maybe Miriam would be best to answer that. It was about legalizing plants versus kind of, well, legalization, cultivation, what's better, that or decriminalization?
Did you want me to repeat the question?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah.
So I'm on the board of directors for the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, and we have a decriminalized nature effort going here, but I'm also Ojibwe from Turtle Mountain. As an Indigenous person, I have opinions about peyote being included, and I'm also doing my doctoral research on plant medicines, PhD in Indigenous studies. So I'm really, grappling with these same questions. So I really want to know what you guys think. This one's a big one, right? Do you think legalizing the plants and regulating cultivation, use, transportation, and sales is the way to help conserve the plants and the biodiversity, or would decriminalizing be better?
Well, I'd love to talk to you more about this than we can in this period of time, but I'm going to go back to something that we've all mentioned before. We want an easy answer, but it unequivocally depends. So when you think about a particular medicine, that needs a particular way of moving forward. And the way to find out what that medicine needs and what conservation means for that medicine is to talk and then listen to the people who have a proven, deep, traditional responsibility to ensuring that that medicine is taken care of for their future generations, for their grandchildren, the people who have that commitment. So what do they say about, is decriminalization good? Is legalization good? And I think the main thing I'll say about policy change, and in the United States, certainly, but also other places, is that any policy change needs to be driven by the people who have medicine sovereignty in relationship to that medicine. It doesn't mean that other people can't benefit or participate in that strategy, but that it needs to start there. And it needs to be some kind of a community process. It needs to have elders involved. It needs to be about really thinking what is the long-term best thing for that medicine. And if you jump that process because you're in a hurry or you think you know better, then you are being disrespectful to that medicine, actually. And for me, this relates to some of the conversations that are going on around patenting and IP. The intellectual property of what's needed by these medicines belongs to nature. And there are people who have trained for generations and for a long time to understand how to interpret that traditional knowledge. And if we don't listen to them, then we are jumping the gun. So for example, with peyote, just to go directly to the one that you mentioned, in my humble opinion, and this is after talking to a lot of people and listening to a lot of people, it's inappropriate to do any regulatory change that includes peyote until there's actually been deep and real conversations with people who've been committed to taking care of peyote their whole lives and also in their families for generations. And that's just appropriate socially, culturally, politically, in order to have good relations between people in our own country, which I hope my child gets to live to see, so there's not an easy answer, but I think, with peyote, we just need to slow down. It should not be included in anything until there's a real community process with Native American peyote people to hear what they want.
Yeah, thank you so much for your responses. And also thank you, Christine, for your really thoughtful and insightful questions. Where we have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll invite someone else to ask a question. And I see there is one from Dario Giofrida. I don't know if Dario wants to share his question live, or if I should read it. Let me see. Okay. Okay, great. Welcome, Dario. If you would like to ask your question, I think it's directed at Anaí.
Hola. Hola, muchas gracias. Pues gracias ante todo por este lindo conversatorio y a Victoria, gracias por la exposición del sapo. Mi pregunta, como con la medicina del sapo y también con mucha de la medicina de la planta, es la sustentabilidad, que a veces me hace cuestionar, ¿no? Cómo, imaginando un utilizo sagrado, también en larga escala, como una medicina tal como la del sapo podría realmente ser sustentable por muchas personas. Un poco lo mismo que hoy en día se habla, ya hace años se habla con el peyote, ¿no? Porque el peyote igual es un cactus a crecimiento muy lento y entonces, digamos, de las más conocidas, el peyote, ahora hoy en día el sapo, creo que entramos en un problema de este tipo. Más allá de que, obviamente, sin considerar el hecho primero que es utilizarlo bien, utilizarlo de manera sagrada y respetuosa. Pero más allá de esto, aunque la multitud lo utilizara bien y de forma respetuosa, ¿cómo se puede garantizar la sustentabilidad? Gracias.
Bueno, te podría decir que en este momento, el sapo no puede estar disponible para millones de personas, como lo dices, en este momento. En el futuro, si todo se regulariza y si están sanas las poblaciones y si logramos verdaderamente que esto, pues que haya una verdadera conservación del sapo y de las comunidades, tal vez, pero yo creo que necesitamos también ver la posibilidad, estudiar la posibilidad de usar el sapo sintético para el mundo occidental, porque de alguna manera, o sea, hay mucho crecimiento, mucho interés en el mundo sobre el uso del sapo y el sapo solamente se da en un pequeñito lugar del planeta. Entonces, pues hemos también estado en diálogos con institutos que están desarrollando una molécula lo más fina y parecida, ¿no? al sapo, y creo que sería también de gran ayuda para el sapo que mucha gente pudiera también acceder al sapo sintético. Recordemos también que hay muchas formas, o sea, toda la humanidad quiere curación, quiere sanación, pero hay muchas otras formas de hacerlo, no únicamente con el sapo, no únicamente con el iboga, con el peyote, con el ayahuasca, con los honguitos, o sea, hay muchas formas de llegar a esto. Entonces, dependiendo del lugar en el que te encuentres en el mundo, estoy segura que hay diferentes posibilidades para ti y para cualquiera. Entonces, sí nos corresponde seguir cuidando, seguir protegiendo, no estar comprando medicina a la gente que venden por internet, porque eso no es sustentable. En este momento deberíamos todos de dejar de fumar sapo, de comprar sapo y dejar descansar por lo menos unos 3 años a la especie para que se recupere, porque es grave lo que está sucediendo. Y por eso no podemos pensar en un futuro si va a ser sustentable, porque en este momento no lo es y en este momento está en riesgo de que el sapo desaparezca en los próximos años. Entonces, como te digo, no pudiera yo responder así, ¿no? Si va a suceder o no va a suceder, estamos haciendo todos los esfuerzos, pero pues así está. Hay que hacer el llamado también a otras personas para que dejen de comprar sapo, porque todo el sapo que se vende por internet no está recolectado de la forma adecuada. Uh-huh.
Gracias, Victoria. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for your question, Dario. Yeah, so I'm aware we're at time, and I'm just so grateful for this beautiful discussion and all of the wisdom that you've all shared, as well as kind of, practical steps that people can take, moving this discussion beyond intellectual and operating in the realm of thought, moving it to a more like action-centered space. I'm sorry that we did not get to answer all the questions, but I hope this was informative for everyone. And I just want to remind everyone that there is the opportunity to donate to Grow Medicine. And so if you'd like to do that, I welcome you to do that. And I just want to say, thank you for everyone for being here, for watching, for participating. Thank you, Tanya, for being a fantastic translator. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody. Gracias.
Bye. Thank you.